Good morning, this is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. The book was written in 1970 and is currently out of print. We are on Chapter 7. They set out at sunrise for Jerusalem and saw the last of the sea, dark purple under a purple sky, the east, over the hills, turning lilac and gold. Hillel ben Baruch rode for a pace in the rushing chariot of his friend and cousin, Aulus Platonius, his gray gold beard flowing behind him, his hood partly covering his face, his cloak streaming in the cool morning wind. It was hardly a pleasure in which he cared to indulge, and he stood beside Aulus and gripped the rail of the chariot, much to the amusement of the charioteer, who sat on the one wooden seat in the pounding vehicle. It was evident that Hillel feared for his life, and did not trust the four black Arabian geldings who tore into the air and the breeze as if still puissant. They foamed at the mouth and tossed their heads, and flecks of foam snapped backwards, and Hillel clung as if his life depended on it. But he wished to talk to his beloved husband, to the beloved husband of his only remaining kin. The chariot led the procession, and the standard of Rome clapped in the wind to Aulus's right, and Aulus stood sturdily, leather wristlets protecting his wrists, a red cloak flaring from his shoulders, his helmet firmly fixed on his round head, his beard lively and fluttering, and his short, sturdy legs braced expertly as he drove. He loved the activity, danger, and rapid movement, and no clash of stone against the iron-rimmed wheels of the chariot did more than sway him a little, whereas poor Hillel expected momentarily to be thrown to the road. Deborah's brothers had always been a weariness to Hillel, and the hours he had spent with them last night had been sufficient for him. God knew he would be forced to endure their company for a considerable time in Israel. He preferred this seemingly reckless charge into the morning, at least for a time, to riding with his kinsmen. "How goes it with you, dearest of friends?" shouted Aulus over the uproar not only of his chariot, but the entourage behind him, and the clatter of the wheels and the hoofs. Hillel shouted back, "Not too happily." Aulus sighed, thinking of the beautiful dead Deborah. He had seen her but 3 times in her short life, and had thought her both entrancing and stupid, desirable traits in a woman. His own Hannah was the noblest of women, with a sweet round face like a plate, and a soft voice which assumed no contradiction, and a temperament which would not have permitted it. The earth began to lighten as the hills lost their darkness, and became of a pale copper and saffron color. Aulus glanced at his friend's face and saw his sadness. Hillel's profile was brooding and melancholy as he sought out landmarks which he had almost forgotten in his years in Tarsus. Hillel said, "What do you think of my son Saul, my only son, whom you have never seen before, Aulus?" "I saw him but fleetingly," said the Roman. It was not like this forthright soldier to be evasive, and Hillel turned his head to him. "Come now," he said. "We were a time on the deck, awaiting our chests and baskets and coffers and pouches, and there were many lanterns and torches, and I saw you watching my son while you directed your men and the sailors, and chatted with the captain. Do not be afraid of offending me, for there is no malice or cruelty in you, Aulus, but only truth and honor." The Roman wiped the dust from his lips with the back of his hand and stared over the heads of his raging horses. One does not need many words to describe a man. If you say a man is weak, or effeminate, or untruthful, or cowardly, or a libertine, you have drawn his portrait. Your son, Hillel, has power." "Power!" exclaimed Hillel in wonder. "I have thought him strong and impatient, and restless and determined, and sometimes contentious, but I did not think of power." Power, repeated Aulus, with a sagacious nod of his head. The power of an old Roman, or perhaps of an old Jew. It is implicit in his eyes, in his glance, in his movements. He also possesses authority, which is only an attribute of power. I think of him as a soldier. To say a man has power is not always flattering, for he can use that essence of soul to the destruction of others. That Saul will never do, and I say this to you truly. He is a young man of honor, like his father. Hillel murmured his thanks, and dared to take one of his gripping hands from the rail to touch one of his friends. Aulus smiled at him, and now, in the growing light, Hillel could see the white shine of Aulus's great white teeth through his bearded lips. Aulus was glad that Hillel did not question him further. He had not been pleased with Saul. The youth had been too removed, seemingly too indifferent to all about him, but Aulus had seen that he saw everything, and that nothing stirred him. He was like one who lived in iron, or who was tormented of soul. "And how is our Milo?" asked Hillel, referring to Aulus's own son, who was 5 years older than Saul. Aulus's broad chest expanded with pride. He pushed his helmet back a little from his brown forehead. He smiled happily. "In Rome at present, with the Praetorian Guard. It is a vast honor to be chosen for the personal protection of Caesar. He is a fine soldier, my Milo. But he is of 2 warrior races, is he not?" Hillel had almost forgotten that his people were indeed of an irascible and warlike breed, proud and stiff-necked, valorous and brave. The Sadducees were always vexing his thoughts, and the Pharisees were too concerned with the minutest phrases of the book, and raising an awful clamor at the slightest breach of a single paragraph of the Scriptures. When they were not expostulating and arguing, they were writing commentaries which unnerved scribes. Between these two was little space to reflect on the prowess of other Jews and the intrepid history of Israel. In an absent tone, Hillel asked, "How are our zealots and Essenes?" Aulus grinned with wryness. "They keep us occupied," he said. "It is conducive to leanness in my men for their climate, and you must admit it is not so salubrious as Rome, nor so mild, and the stony hills are endless and the caves countless. Your zealots and Essenes still believe it is possible to defeat Rome and throw us into the sea. They must be admired for patriotism and dedication, if not for extreme intelligence and reason." But Hillel could not smile at this. Those unfortunate and zealous young men, loving their God and their country above all else, and endlessly harassing the mighty Roman. It was useless, but it was also noble. There were some who did not ignore the Romans, as did the Pharisees, nor fraternize with them and admire them, as did the Sadducees. It was folly to resist it. It was more heroic than not resisting. Let me say that again. If it was folly to resist it, was more heroic than not resisting. And had not God rescued the Israelites from Pharaoh and from the walls of Babylon when it seemed hopeless? Who knew the future? The dream of freedom never left the hearts of men. Now the sun, like a golden and conquering warrior, mounted the farthest somber hill, and the earth was flooded with dazzling light. It was autumn, and the harvests were full, and many of the fields on each side of the road were yellow and smooth as a good cheese, and sun-darkened shepherds in rough robes and headcloths were moving through the last garnering with their sheep. Little villages flew past the entourage, pale saffron of brick and stucco, narrow small houses with slit-like windows and streets between them little more than stony slits themselves. Here and there walls appeared, careful yellowish stone laid neatly upon stone, without mortar, crowded with climbing vines whose leaves were like blood. The sun was hot, but the air was cool and flowing, and now the sea was lost to the left. Cypress trees, dark and stately and rigid, sometimes lined the road, then gave way to copses of climbing pines, resinous and stimulating, then to the silvery olive groves, heavy with green and dark fruit, then to the rows of yellow citrons or pomegranates, bending under the globes like polished fire. Gray boulders and high thistles clustered at the roadside, surrendering to meadows, suddenly green and radiant in the morning light, and vineyards, whose vines were thick with opalescent grapes. The approaching hills and those distant on either hand were gray or copper and worn as huge ancient stone. The Romans had denuded them of cypresses to build their ships, and though many were terraced like giant steps and carefully cultivated with vegetables and vineyards, they had a desolate look, blasted and hungry. They were less mountains than barriers between the crowding villages and towns of yellow or brown brick. Goats clamored on those hot terraces, now bending palms, cast a sharp shade and rattled and glistened with a dust as the entourage roared by. But little brooks and rivers shone and gamboled in the tawny autumn light, and the whole country was exuberant and vital with the odors of stone, floating golden dust, fields, grapes, fruit, barley, and wheat, hot green grass and resin. Farmers were abroad with their sons, carrying baskets in which they placed bunches of sweet syrupy dates and figs and pomegranates and olives and citrons, and herds of cattle moved on the meadows, and girls with geese ran across the road laughing, their gay headdresses streaming in the brilliant air. There would be another crop to lay for wheat in the spring, and many farmers, black-cloaked with white headcloths, were plowing, the patient asses going before, the dark earth turning and streaming. Once or twice, as the entourage raced by, an encroaching small hill gushed with blue or green water, and little children splashed in the pools below, and goats came to drink and fowl. Haystacks dotted the yellow land, and stacks of wheat and barley, and flat-roofed little farmhouses with white walls peeped shyly from groves of palms or sycamores or carob trees. Crimson and purple flowers lay in eddies in the drying grass. The landscape began to dance with the heat of the sun, so that it hurt the eyes, and there was a vast radiance everywhere. Everything swam in light. Hillel threw back his hood. He could not have enough of seeing his native land and remembrance. The sky was so vivid with blue effulgence that it appeared to burn. Round, tall Roman guard towers threw shade, and soldiers stood in it. Young men with alert faces and searching eyes, their helmets glinting, their muscled legs polished. A few leaned against the towers and surreptitiously munched fruit, or went inside the cool interior for a refreshing drink of wine, while their officers, as young themselves, pretended not to notice. In and out of hot villages and towns, odorous and loud, even so early as this, with the merchants in stalls, and the market rabble, and women carrying baskets, and children running and shouting, and the donkeys braying, and the curses of hurrying men and wagons, and horses and camels, the entourage roared, for they must find shelter before the full blasting heat of the autumn day. The cool wind had died. Not everyone was choking on dust, and wiping lips, and huddling within hoods, and dashing away sweat. In Rome, said Aulus, there is a refreshing wind from the sea, and a coolness from the Campana, and a green breath from the Alban hills. Yes, said Hillel, but he thought his country more vital than Rome, and its suburbs for all it was a little land, and conquered. Strange was that men and races came and went, and there were clashes of arms and change and terror and slavery, but the land and those who worked and nurtured the land remained. There was a certain eternal serenity on the earth, which none could disturb. It held the dead and the living, and was equally indifferent to both. It had its own being. It was a gigantic tomb for countless nations lay buried in the earth, and their flesh and bones fed it. But it was also triumphant life. The Romans had been there when Hillel was a youth, but he saw many more rich villas now near the road than he had remembered, with high stone walls and glimpses of rainbowed gardens and fountains through iron gates. This depressed him. He wondered what his son and daughter were thinking of their country, which they had never seen before. He envied them. How glorious it was to view Israel for the first time, this ancient and holy land, this land of milk and honey from which sprang the immortal moral laws of God, and which still echoes with the voice of Sinai, and from whose flesh the Messiah would be born and cast the light of his eyes. The Greeks had elaborated and cherished the glory of the mind, and philosophy, and beauty beyond imagining, and reason, and civilized behavior, and demos, and the graceful gods and songs, had built radiant cities, and had invented poesy, and dialogue, and perfect art, and the Romans had struck grandeur on the earth, and had brought law above all to chaotic civilizations and barbarians, and were architects and engineers and scientists beyond anything the world had ever known before, and had introduced sanitation and clean water to the remotest places, and were tolerant and just and powerful and handsome and sane, and had produced Ciceros and Catos and Virgils, as well as Catalinas and Caesares, and measured representative government and order and commerce and trade. But neither Greece nor Rome, nor even mystic Egypt, nor India had produced the promise of the ages, nor had they opened the portals of men's souls to the visage and the law of God. Despite what the Pharisees declared, the Jews were not a people, not a race, in the full meaning of the terms. They were at best but the modern descendants of desperate nomadic tribes who came from no one knew where, and whose destiny was still unknown, but only conjectured by those who studied the Kabbalah. Always they had been surrounded by the Semitic peoples, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, the Arabs, the Moabites, the Philistines, the Egyptians, Syrians, Babylonians, Persians, and a dozen others, and always they had been strangers among them. Fought, cursed, reviled, enslaved, driven forth, killed, destroyed, beaten, and scattered. But always they had returned to their little country, blood-stained but unconquered, to raise again the temple to their God, and to shout, as Moses had triumphantly shouted, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Then it seemed to Hillel that a mysterious voice sounded in his spirit, "The drama has just begun." His soul lifted in a strange exultation, and his eyes brightened, and he knew not why, but he was filled with both a powerful sorrow and a powerful joy. He wished to communicate these things, but his tongue felt heavy, and he had no words. Alas, alas, he thought, the deepest voice of the soul cannot be uttered except to God. And we're going to pause there and move on to part 2.